They arrived expecting shouting, punishment, and constant pressure, because fear was the only language they believed captivity could speak. Yet what surrounded them instead was calm routine, ordinary movement, and an absence of threat that felt so unnatural it raised a deeper question, not about what might happen to them, but about what this quiet environment was slowly doing to their sense of control, expectation, and self. They arrived already convinced that fear would be immediate, because fear had always been described as the first language of captivity, the tool meant to strip resistance quickly and remind a prisoner of his position before anything else could take shape. Every step toward the camp carried that expectation, as though fear were a physical presence waiting just beyond the gate, ready to assert itself once movement stopped and waiting began. Their minds had rehearsed this moment repeatedly, preparing for raised voices, rigid posture, and the constant pressure of being watched, because fear was supposed to provide clarity, drawing a sharp line between authority and submission. It was expected to define the space, to give captivity a recognizable shape that could be endured through endurance alone. Yet as they crossed into the camp, that clarity failed to materialize. The environment did not announce itself with hostility or urgency, and nothing in the air suggested an immediate shift from anticipation to punishment. Guards were visible, but their presence felt procedural rather than aggressive, their movements measured and unhurried, as though the routine itself carried more importance than intimidation. This absence did not feel reassuring. Instead, it created a pause that lingered uncomfortably, forcing the men to remain mentally prepared without knowing what they were preparing for. Fear had been expected to arrive loudly and decisively, but instead there was only structure, order, and a calm that resisted interpretation. Routine began almost immediately, not as a response to threat, but as a continuation of motion, guiding them from one moment to the next without requiring confrontation. Instructions were given clearly, but without emphasis, and compliance occurred not because of visible pressure, but because nothing suggested resistance was necessary. What unsettled them was not kindness or cruelty, but neutrality. The camp functioned smoothly enough to feel intentional, and that intention was difficult to reconcile with the image of captivity they had carried with them. Fear was supposed to dominate the experience, yet here it remained absent, leaving behind a space that felt unfinished. They waited for escalation, believing that what they were seeing could not be complete, because captivity without fear felt incomplete, as though an essential element had been delayed rather than removed. This waiting sharpened attention, causing them to observe small details more closely, searching for signs that would confirm their expectations. Time passed without confirmation. Nothing arrived to justify the tension they maintained internally, and the effort required to remain ready without a clear threat began to weigh on the mind. Fear, when delayed, does not remain sharp, but stretches thin, becoming harder to sustain with each uneventful moment. The men continued to act cautiously, not because they were instructed to, but because uncertainty encouraged restraint. Movement slowed, conversations remained measured, and behavior aligned itself with routine rather than reaction, as though the absence of fear had quietly redirected attention inward. What they did not yet understand was that fear had not been withheld accidentally. The environment around them did not rely on intimidation to function, and that realization, still forming but not yet complete, marked the first disruption to the mental framework they had brought with them. They had prepared themselves to endure fear, believing that endurance alone would carry them through captivity. Yet endurance requires an adversary, and here the adversary refused to appear. In its place stood a calm that felt deliberate, stable, and resistant to challenge. By the end of the first days, the The question had begun to shift subtly, no longer asking when fear would arrive, but why it had not, and what it meant to exist in a place where the expected pressure failed to present itself. That unanswered question lingered quietly, setting the stage for a realization none of them were yet ready to confront. As the days continued, the men remained suspended in a state of expectation that refused to resolve itself, because the fear they had prepared for never appeared, and the absence of that defining pressure began to reshape their perception of the camp in subtle, unsettling ways. They woke each morning still anticipating a shift in tone, a correction, or an escalation that would finally align experience with expectation. Yet routine unfolded with the same measured consistency, indifferent to their readiness and unmoved by their caution. Nothing announced a change, and nothing suggested that fear was merely delayed, leaving them to confront the possibility that what they were experiencing was not a prelude, but the condition itself. The camp operated without urgency, relying on repetition rather than threat to structure the day, and that repetition carried a quiet authority of its own, guiding behavior without requiring enforcement. Instructions were followed not because of fear of consequence, but because nothing invited refusal, creating a form of compliance that felt automatic rather than imposed. Without fear to organize their responses, attention began to drift inward. The men found themselves monitoring their own reactions more closely than the actions of guards, noticing how quickly alertness softened into watchfulness, and how watchfulness slowly gave way to acceptance of the routine as something stable and predictable. This adjustment did not feel like surrender. It felt practical, even necessary, because remaining constantly prepared without an object for that preparation became exhausting. Fear, when it does not arrive, begins to dissolve into fatigue, and fatigue encourages accommodation rather than resistance. Conversations reflected this shift, moving away from speculation about punishment or retaliation and toward observations about timing, procedure, and the small patterns that repeated themselves each day. Language adapted to the environment, narrowing its focus to what was immediately present, as though discussing possibilities beyond routine required an effort no longer supported by circumstance. What disturbed them most was the realization that mistakes passed without response. Minor deviations drew no attention. Hesitation produced no correction, and stillness required no explanation, quietly teaching them that fear was not the mechanism maintaining order. The camp did not rely on intimidation to function, and that realization unsettled the assumptions they had brought with them. Time continued to move forward without escalation, and the longer fear failed to arrive, the more difficult it became to maintain the mental framework built around its expectation. Preparedness without threat began to feel unnecessary, and the mind, seeking efficiency, started to release tension that no longer served a clear purpose. This release was gradual and unmarked. No moment stood out as the point of change, because the change occurred through repetition, through the steady reinforcement of routine that asked nothing and promised nothing in return. The environment did not pressure them into adaptation, but allowed adaptation to occur naturally without resistance. As alertness softened, behavior adjusted accordingly. Movements became less deliberate, posture less guarded, and the constant internal calculation of risk began to fade, replaced by an unspoken understanding that the environment was unlikely to respond dramatically to individual action. Yet this calm carried an undercurrent of unease. Fear had been expected to clarify roles, to establish boundaries, and to provide a clear reference for behavior. And without it, the men found themselves navigating a space that lacked emotional markers. Nothing felt overtly threatening, but nothing felt fully defined either. The absence of fear did not produce relief. It produced ambiguity, and ambiguity required interpretation. In the absence of clear signals, the mind began to accept the present condition as sufficient, gradually reorganizing expectations around what persisted rather than what was anticipated. By the end of this period, the men no longer waited for fear with the same intensity, not because they felt safe, but because waiting itself had lost urgency. The question of when fear would arrive had quietly shifted into a different, more troubling uncertainty, one that lingered without demanding resolution. What they had not yet recognized was that fear had been replaced, not by safety, but by a structure that functioned without emotional extremes, allowing routine and time to shape behavior in ways that were less visible, but no less influential. That realization, still incomplete, marked the threshold of a deeper transformation that had already begun to take hold. As fear continued to remain absent, something else began to settle quietly into its place, not arriving suddenly or announcing itself, but forming gradually through repetition, familiarity, and the steady passage of time that no longer carried tension with it. This presence did not demand attention, and that was precisely what made it effective, because it shaped behavior without confrontation, encouraging adjustment rather than resistance. The men did not recognize it at first, since it did not resemble any force they had been trained to anticipate, and it did not operate through pressure or threat. Routine deepened, becoming less a temporary structure and more a framework around which thought began to organize itself. Days followed one another without variation strong enough to provoke reaction, allowing predictability to replace vigilance as the dominant mental state. In this environment, movement no longer required justification, nor did stillness raise concern. Both existed side by side without consequence, slowly teaching the mind that effort was optional and that maintaining internal readiness served no practical function. What replaced fear was not comfort, but neutrality, a condition in which emotional extremes were gradually leveled, leaving behind a sense of balance that felt unnatural yet difficult to challenge. Without fear to sharpen perception, moments blurred together, and the distinction between waiting and living became less clear. The men noticed that decisions required more effort than before, not because options were limited, but because the absence of pressure removed urgency. Choice existed, yet it no longer demanded engagement, making an action feel reasonable rather than avoidant. Thoughts that once moved quickly toward preparation began to slow, settling into observation rather than anticipation. Attention drifted toward the present moment, not with awareness, but with resignation, as though the future had temporarily lost relevance. The environment reinforced this shift without appearing to intervene. Nothing encouraged action, and nothing discouraged it either, creating a psychological space where neutrality became the safest position, offering stability without requiring commitment. Over time, the men began to measure days not by events, but by continuity. The absence of disruption became its own form of confirmation, suggesting that the current state required no response and no adaptation beyond acceptance. This condition reshaped behavior subtly. Conversations shortened, not because words were restricted, but because language itself felt unnecessary in a space where nothing needed explanation. Silence did not signal tension. It signaled alignment with the rhythm of the place. What made this transformation difficult to detect was its lack of contrast. Fear leaves an imprint because it demands reaction, but neutrality dissolves boundaries quietly, allowing the mind to settle into patterns without resistance. As effort faded, so did the sense of agency. Actions occurred, but they no longer felt chosen in the same way, emerging instead from habit and routine, guided by what was easiest rather than what was intentional. This was not experienced as loss. Nothing had been taken, and nothing had been denied. Instead, the men felt an increasing sense of completion, as though the environment had answered questions they had not yet fully formed. What took fear's place did not confine them, nor did it restrain them openly. It simply removed the need to push against anything, allowing time and routine to carry them forward without friction. By the end of this period, the absence of fear no longer felt strange. It felt expected. The environment had succeeded in redefining normality, and in doing so, had introduced a force more subtle than intimidation, one that shaped behavior by making resistance feel unnecessary. What they had not yet realized was that this quiet replacement was not neutral at all, but the beginning of a deeper shift, one in which control no longer needed to be felt to be effective, because it had already been absorbed into daily life. As the days passed without disruption, the men began to notice that decision itself was slowly retreating from daily life, not because options were removed, but because nothing demanded that those options be weighed or acted upon. The environment no longer presented moments that required judgment, leaving behavior to follow the path of least resistance with quiet consistency. Choice still existed in theory, but it no longer announced itself as something requiring attention. Actions unfolded naturally from routine rather than intention, guided by repetition and familiarity instead of evaluation or desire. In this state, doing nothing felt as legitimate as doing something, and often far easier to justify. The absence of pressure made decision-making feel strangely artificial, as though choosing required an unnecessary interruption to a system that already functioned smoothly. Without urgency, the mind conserved effort, allowing habit to replace deliberation and predictability to stand in for purpose. The camp reinforced this condition without instruction. Nothing encouraged initiative and nothing punished hesitation, creating a psychological equilibrium in which remaining still felt correct simply because it matched the surrounding rhythm. The men adjusted without resistance, not realizing that adjustment itself was a form of surrender. What made this shift difficult to recognize was its practicality. Letting routine decide removed uncertainty and reduced internal conflict, offering relief from the constant evaluation that fear once demanded. In this way, the absence of fear did not liberate them, but simplified their experience, narrowing the scope of thought to what was immediately required. Conversations reflected this narrowing. Topics that implied future action or possibility gradually faded, replaced by observations about timing, sequence, and repetition. Language adapted to the environment, favoring statements over questions and descriptions over intentions. As choice became less relevant, identity followed. Without decisions to define themselves against, the men found fewer opportunities to assert individuality, allowing roles to flatten into shared behavior that required no explanation. Difference existed, but it no longer mattered enough to influence action. Movement within the camp continued, but it felt increasingly automatic, guided by established patterns rather than conscious direction. Even moments that once invited consideration passed without pause, absorbed into the flow of routine before they could register as potential turning points. This automaticity did not feel imposed. It felt efficient. Effort was reserved for what was necessary, and unnecessary effort gradually came to include decision itself. The mind learned that engaging deeply with choice offered no clear reward, encouraging disengagement rather than exploration. What replaced intention was a quiet form of acceptance, not articulated or acknowledged, but present in behavior. The men complied with the structure of daily life, not because they were compelled, but because nothing suggested an alternative that felt equally stable. Over time, this acceptance reshaped perception. The environment began to feel complete, as though it no longer awaited change or resolution. Days passed without anticipation, and anticipation itself became unfamiliar, losing its emotional charge through disuse. The realization that choice was becoming unnecessary did not arrive suddenly. It surfaced gradually, in the form of diminished reaction to possibility, and a growing comfort with repetition that required no justification. What once might have felt temporary now felt sufficient. By the end of this phase, decision-making had not disappeared, but it had been displaced, relegated to the background of consciousness where it no longer influenced behavior directly. The men continued to act, but action no longer felt like an expression of will. What they had not yet understood was that this quiet disengagement from choice represented a deeper transformation than fear ever could, because it did not provoke resistance. It invited compliance by making resistance feel inefficient, unnecessary, and out of place. This was the moment when control no longer needed to be asserted, because it had already been internalized, carried forward by routine, and reinforced by the comfort of not having to decide. As time continued to move forward without interruption, the men reached a point where the absence of decision no longer felt temporary or unresolved, but settled into daily life as a stable condition that required no explanation. What had once appeared as hesitation gradually solidified into a consistent pattern, making stillness feel complete rather than unfinished. They no longer experienced moments as opportunities waiting to be evaluated, because evaluation itself had faded from relevance. Days unfolded without internal debate, and behavior followed routine with such familiarity that questioning it felt unnecessary. In this state, not choosing did not feel passive but sufficient. The mind adapted to this condition efficiently. Without decisions to weigh or alternatives to consider, thought narrowed its focus to what was immediate and predictable, conserving energy by avoiding possibilities that offered no clear benefit. Choice still existed in theory, but it no longer functioned as a motivating force. What made this shift especially powerful was its quietness. There was no moment of realization, no visible sign that something essential had changed, because the change occurred through repetition rather than intention. Each day reinforced the last, allowing continuity to replace direction as the organizing principle of experience. The men did not feel restrained. Nothing around them suggested restriction, and nothing within them demanded movement. The absence of conflict created a sense of balance that felt natural, making action seem disruptive rather than necessary. Over time, the distinction between remaining and choosing to remain dissolved entirely. Staying no longer required justification, because it aligned perfectly with the rhythm of the environment. Leaving, by contrast, began to feel abstract, disconnected from daily life, and increasingly difficult to imagine in practical terms. This was not experienced as loss. No opportunity appeared to be taken away, and no desire felt suppressed. Instead, the present state seemed complete, offering consistency without uncertainty and predictability without demand. In this way, not choosing became the most efficient way to exist. Behavior reflected this internal alignment. Movement occurred when required, pauses happened without discomfort, and compliance no longer carried emotional weight. The men acted, but action no longer originated from intention, emerging instead from habit and routine reinforced over time. As identity adjusted to this pattern, individuality softened. Differences between individuals mattered less, not because they vanished, but because they no longer influenced behavior. The shared rhythm of daily life replaced personal direction, creating a collective state defined by continuity rather than choice. The environment did not enforce this condition. It merely sustained it. By offering stability without challenge, it allowed disengagement from decision-making to feel reasonable, even logical. In this way, control did not need to be applied because it no longer encountered resistance. What finalized this transformation was the absence of emotional response. Fear had faded long ago, and hope followed it quietly, leaving behind a neutral state where remaining felt neither good nor bad, but simply appropriate. Without emotional contrast, the idea of change lost its urgency. By the time this condition fully settled, the question of choice had lost its meaning. Not choosing was no longer a response to uncertainty, but the default mode of existence. The men continued forward in time without actively directing themselves, carried by routine that required no participation beyond presence. What they did not yet articulate was that this quiet resolution marked the completion of a process more effective than fear, one in which control no longer needed to be imposed or resisted, because it had been absorbed into the structure of daily life itself. Nothing marked the end of this process, because nothing dramatic ever needed to happen. Days continued to pass, routines held their shape, and the absence of fear remained quietly intact, no longer noticed, no longer questioned. What mattered was not what had been taken away, but what had slowly stopped being used. Choice did not disappear, yet it no longer asked to be exercised. Movement remained possible, but possibility alone was no longer enough to provoke action. By the time the environment felt complete, the struggle had already ended without confrontation, leaving behind a condition where staying required no decision, and leaving no longer felt urgent. The unsettling truth was not that fear had failed to appear, but that something more effective had taken its place, shaping behavior without resistance and settling into the mind without being named. And that leaves one final question, not about this camp or these men, but about how often control succeeds not by force, but by making choice feel unnecessary. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.